We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 13b. And the previous Amud Rav Asi said that if you have judges who don't know the halachas of Gittin and Kiddushin well, that can be worse for the world than the Dor HaMabul if they issue rulings related to these issues. And the Gemara brought a pasuk from Hosea to that effect. And the Gemara had asked on the previous Amud, but maybe that pasuk in Hosea lists a number of averos. Maybe it's talking about if you do all of those averos. Maybe it's not only referring to the averos related to adultery. And to that, the Gemara now answers michsiv u partsu ksiv. It doesn't say with a vav, it says partsu. It doesn't say u partsu. And Rashi explains michsiv u partsu demosav al inyan rishon. If it had a vav, it would be adding on to what was first mentioned. The neko al ken akula milsa. Then the pasuk would be going on all of the averos and saying one who does all of these averos is worse than the Dor HaMabul, but it doesn't have a vav, and so therefore it's just going, as Rashi says, partsu ksiv umilsa ba'apei nafshi. It's just going on this one case. Ve'alol l'chuda ksiv. It's on this case alone, meaning related to adultery. It's going on that. Al kain teyavil. That's what the pasuk is saying when it says because of that the land mourns. And again, that's why this is a good source from this pasuk in Hosea. And the Gemara continues, Hadr Yasri v'Ka'amri. So then they were sitting, and again they were saying over the teachings of Rav Asi after Rav Asi died. Hadatanan, that which we learned in the Mishnah, Ha'isha shehivia chatasa. Let's say a woman who gave birth to a child, she brings her carbon chatas, v'meisa, and then she dies. Yaviu yarshin olasa. So her yarshim, they have to bring her carbon ola. And we have a machlokas amoraim on that Mishnah. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says v'hu she'ifrishta mechayim. That's only true if she already separated the carbon ola while she was alive. Avalo ifrishta mechayim lo. But if she never separated the animal as a carbon ola while she was alive, so then there is no obligation upon the Yarshim. And the Gemara points out, Alma Kasavar, we see that Shmuel holds, Shibuda lav doraisa, that there's no shibud on her property on a doraisa level, that her property needs to take care of this obligation of this carbon ola. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan. Now Rav Asi says, that Rav Yochanan says, Rav Asi argues, and that this again is one of the teachings of Rav Asi that they were collecting after his death. Rav Asi says that Rav Yochanan says, Afal gav shelo ifrisha mechayim, even though she didn't separate the animal while she was alive, she didn't separate the carbon ola, still there's going to be an obligation upon the Yarshim to bring this carbon ola. Alma Kasavar, so you see that Rav Yochanan holds, Shibuda have a doraisa, that the shibud actually is a shibud on a doraisa level, her property is obligated to fulfill this obligation. Now the Gemara says, V'pligi b'chada zimna, but this was really already a machlokus. We've already seen this machlokus, whether shibud is doraisa or not, between Shmuel and Rav Yochanan. The Ravu Shmuel da Amri Tarvayu, because Rav and Shmuel both say, milva al peh, when it comes to a loan that's not written down, so eina govim in a yarshim v'lo min alakuchos, you don't collect such a loan from yarshim, you don't collect such a loan from lakuchos. You see that shibud is not doraisa, according to Rav and Shmuel. Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish da Amri Tarvayu, and Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they both say, milva al peh, that when it comes to a milva al peh, gove bein min yarshim, bein min alakuchos, you do collect, whether from yarshim, whether from lakuchos. You see that shibud is doraisa, according to Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So we already have this machlokas between Rav Yochanan and Shmuel. And the Gemara says, Tzricha, no, we need both cases. We need to have the case by the carbon ola, and we need it by a general milva al peh. Di'itmar baha bahach kamar Shmuel, mishum delo milva ksuva betorei. Because if we only had the one case, meaning if you only had the case of a standard milva al peh, so you would say that Shmuel would say a standard milva al peh, there is no shibud, you don't collect from the yarshim, you don't collect from the lakuchos. That's because that's not an obligation, it's not a loan that's written in the Torah, unlike this carbon ola, which is an obligation from the Torah for a yoledis to bring this carbon. But it could be, again, if you have an obligation like a carbon ola for a yoledis, which is written in the Torah, so maybe Shmuel would agree, he would admit to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that there is in fact a chiyuv in that case, and it's a chiyuv that continues with the yarshim. And again, the other way around as well, if we only had the case when we're talking about the carbon, so I would say maybe only over there Rabbi Yochanan said that there's an obligation because a milva that's written in the Torah, that's the same as a shtar, that's why the yarshim are obligated to bring the carbon ola. But it could be in the other case, meaning in a case where it's just a regular milva al peh, Rabbi Yochanan would maybe admit to Shmuel and say there is no obligation on the yarshim and the lakuchos, and so therefore tzricha, therefore we need that case as well to say again that according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, by a milva al peh there is a chiyuv, there's an obligation upon the yarshim and the lakuchos to pay the debt. And the Gemara continues, Amar Papa says, Hilchasa, the halacha is, milva al peh govim in Yarshim, that when it comes to a milva al peh, you could collect that from Yarshim. However, ve'eno govim in lakuchos, but you don't collect from lakuchos. We actually make a distinction between Yarshim and lakuchos. Why? Govim in Yarshin, shibuda doraisa. We collect from the Yarshim because the shibud is in fact doraisa. There's an obligation. The obligation continues to the Yarshim. If that's the case, why doesn't the obligation continue to the lakuchos? V'eno govim in lakuchos. You don't collect from lakuchos. The less lay kala, because when you have a milva that's done al peh, so the coal doesn't go out. People are not aware of it, and the lakuchos don't realize that they need to be careful. Oh, I shouldn't buy from this particular person because this person has a debt. They don't know about the debt because it was a milva al peh, and therefore the fact that you didn't write it down, you didn't put it into a shtar, and there's no coal, that's essentially your fault, and therefore you cannot collect from lakuchos who would have had no way to be aware that this happened. And Rashi explains, Ha'isha yoledes, again, we're talking about a woman who gave birth to a child, Vushe frishta mechayim. So again, according to Shmuel, she separated the animal as a carbon ola while she was alive. Only then the Yarshim have to bring the carbon. The Ashminan dekreva lachar misa. The Chiddush would be that it's brought even after her death. Avalo frishta, but if she didn't separate it, lo Ashminan tana lochav es haYarshim lakriva. The Yarshim would not have to bring such a carbon. Shalom is chayv hanachasim. There's no chiv on her property to bring that carbon. Kasavar hadamar rabbanan nechse mishtabdi al chov hamut. So, according to this approach, the Rabbanan, when the Rabbanan say that the property is meshubad on a chov, the property of the person who died, lav doraisi, that idea that the property, that there's a shibud on the property, that's not doraisa, according to Shmuel. Lomar dinechsoi dinish arvin be, that we say the property of a person is like his guarantor, umishtabdim midin arv, and it should be meshubad from a din of arv, like a guarantor, v'yu milva al peh, milva b'shtar shavin. According to that, it doesn't matter if it's a milva al peh or a milva b'shtar, it's all equal. Ela milva b'shtar shu shibdo. Rather, we don't say that. Rather, according to Shmuel, if you have a milva written into a shtar, so then written into the shtar is the shibud, the chasav, because it's actually written over there, nechasai achroin lach, that my property is achroi for this loan. So then mishtabdi, then we say it's meshubed. But milva al peh lo mishtabdi, but according to Shmuel, a milva al peh is not going to be meshubed. Ravasi Amar v'hanami lin kutinu l'shmaite amru hasam, and again, Ravasi, he disagrees, and he says even a milva al peh, there is going to be a shibud, even though she didn't separate the animal mechayim while she was alive. Again, this is just collecting Ravasi's teachings. And the Gemara then said, "Hapligi b'chadazim." That we already had this machlok, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Hani amoroi gufayu, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan in general argue whether milva al peh can be collected from Yarshim and lakuchos. Eina govim in Yarshim. Again, according to the opinion of Shmuel, you don't collect from Yarshim. The shibud lav doraisa, because the shibud is not doraisa. V'kol sheken min lakuchos. If you don't collect from Yarshim, you certainly don't collect from lakuchos. Who didn't know any better. Avol milva b'shtar hu atzmo shibdo. But again, by milva b'shtar, it's different, because there, the person who actually took out the loan, he actually was written into the document. He wrote that the property, there's a shibud on the property, because he writes there, all my property is achroi for this shtar. The lav milva haksuva b'torah, and then the Gemara said we need both cases, because a regular milva al peh is not written in the Torah. There's no obligation from the king, from God. It's just something that he did. He took out a loan. But by a woman who gives birth, the mitzvah hamelachi, it's a command from the king. Maybe that should be so chamer, just like it's written in a shtar. And then finally, at the end of the Gemara, we make a distinction. According to Rav Papa, we make a distinction between Yarshim and lakuchos. Lakuchos, they don't have to pay the less leikala, because again, if you have a milva al peh, the word does not go out. V'iyu dafsed anafshe, and therefore it's the malva's own fault that he didn't write it down in a shtar. He didn't put out the coal, therefore he can't collect from lakuchos. V'afagav the shibud doraisa, even though shibud is doraisa, technically he should be able to collect from lakuchos. Avad rabbanan takanta lokeach lo have yada, but the lokeach had no way of knowing about this loan, and therefore the rabbanan make a takana on his behalf that again that he's not able to collect from the lakuchos. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'kona es atzma beget uvemisas habal." She acquires herself with a get, meaning to say, when a wife receives a get from her husband, she can marry anyone she wants, and also with the death of her husband. Once her husband dies, she's permitted to marry any man. And the Gemara says, "B'shlom a get." I understand when she receives a get why she's permitted. T'chsiv, it's written in the pasuk, "V'chasav lo sefer krisus." It says he writes for a sefer krisus. He writes for her a get. When he gives her a get, she becomes permitted to marry any man. Elamisas habal min nolan. But from where do we know that when her husband dies, she can now marry any man? And the Gemara says, "Svarhu, it's logical. Hu asra v'hu sharsa." He created the prohibition, and therefore when he dies, that permits her. But the Gemara says, "V'harayas." But what about arayas? The asr lahu, that he creates the prohibition. V'lo sharilu. But when he dies, it doesn't make her permitted. She's not allowed to marry his relatives. Rashi says, "V'hu shari lo," he permits her, "Kishe'eno ba'olam niftara heimenu," meaning when he's no longer in the world, she is patur from him. Sharei bo ha'isa kshura, she was tied to him, she's no longer tied to him, and therefore there's no isser. That's the logic, but the Gemara says it's not necessarily true. What about arayis? Arayis could go in Eishes Aviv, for example, the wife of his father, the kaloso, Eishes Achi Aviv, all these different relatives. Shal yidei kiddushay abal nesru, through the kiddushin of the husband, they become prohibited. She's not allowed to marry lekrova, she's prohibited to his relatives. Uchashayamas habal, when the husband dies, lo sharu luhu shasuras lekrova v'liolam. So she's not permitted to his relatives, she's usher to his relatives forever. So you see that there are situations where he can create an isser, and then when he dies, she's not necessarily permitted. And so the Gemara says, Ella, rather, what's the source that when a husband dies, the wife is now permitted to marry anyone? From the fact that the Torah says, by a yavam, if she doesn't have children, when she has to do yibum, she's usher to marry anybody else. She's only allowed to marry the yavam. She can only marry her brother-in-law in the case of yibum. And so therefore we understand, hayesh labanim, but if she had children, if there is no obligation of yibum, mutaris, apparently she's mutter to marry anyone she wants. And that's how you see, kones atzma, that she acquires herself, b'misas habal, when the husband dies. But the Gemara says, not necessarily. Maybe when she has no children, so then she's usher to everyone else, but she's still permitted to the yavam, then she's permitted to the brother-in-law. But maybe when she has the children, so maybe she's usher to everyone in such a situation. When she has banim, when she has sons, so she's usher not only to everyone else, she's usher to the yavam as well. So there's no proof from the concept of yibum that in general the death of a husband allows his wife to marry anyone she wants. And so the Gemara tries another source, rather from the fact that the Torah says a widow is not allowed to marry a Kohen Gadol, so it sounds like the widow can marry other people. So for example, to a Kohen Hedyot, to a regular Kohen, she's permitted. Apparently the death of the husband permitted her. But the Gemara says not necessarily. Maybe to marry a Kohen Gadol is a violation of a negative commandment, but l'kuli alma, but to marry anyone else, maybe there's a violation of a positive commandment. Rashi explains, maybe we learn that when there's a divorce, she marries someone else. That's a positive commandment. But death is not allowed, meaning to say a positive commandment that if she leaves her husband because her husband died, so there she's not allowed to marry someone else. In other words, we mean this particular woman where she got a divorce, she's the one that can marry someone else. Positive commandment, but in a different situation where she left her husband because her husband died, it would be a violation of a positive commandment for her to marry someone else. Maybe that's really what it means when we have this prohibition to a Kohen Gadol. Maybe l'kuli alma is basei. But the Gemara says that can't be. Hayasei mayavidite, because what's going on with this asay, that the asay does not fall away with all the other prohibitions? Meaning what we're suggesting right now is that when her husband dies, so she's no longer an Eishes Ish. There's no all these prohibitions related to Eishes Ish, that it's adultery and she's chayiv misa, that doesn't apply. But the asay, that remains in place. How could that be? If the death of the husband helps and it takes away prohibitions, tishtri lagamri, so she should be totally permitted. And if the death of the husband does not permit, it doesn't cause the prohibitions to fall away, so tukma b'milsa kamaisa, so she should still be with her original prohibition of adultery. There should be a full problem over here of Eishes Ish. We shouldn't say that some prohibitions apply and some don't apply. That's what Rashi explains. The asay stands in front of her, that prevents her from marrying someone else, but all of the other isurim fall away, the lav and the kares, that all falls away. If it helps, it helps, meaning if the death of the husband takes away prohibitions, it takes them all away. And if not. Tashmiach kra dein misa mishaleches, meaning the pasuk is either telling you misa does nothing, or the pasuk is telling you misa permits her. Tukma b'milsa kamaisa v'lo itzrich lemichtav lav b'kohen gadol. Again, we should just say that the original Eishes Ish applies. You would not need a lav by a kohen gadol, so it should be all or nothing. This whole concept that by a kohen gadol you're going to have a lav, and by everyone else you're going to have an asay, but everything else will fall away, that doesn't make sense. But the Gemara says, why doesn't it make sense? Alam Allah, why not? Why can't it be that all the prohibitions fall away, but there remains an asay to marry another man, and by a Kohen Gadol there's an additional negative commandment by a Kohen Gadol? Why not? Alam Allah, why not? Apiksa mi misa. We take her away. There's no longer a chiyuv misa. Vukimta al asay, and instead there's a positive commandment. There's only a violation of a positive commandment, as Rashi says, apikte misas habal michiyuv misas bezin. When the husband dies, so she's no longer chayiv misa in court if she's with another man. Vukimta b'isra asay, but there still is an isra asay. The Torah now says there's an isra asay, and we find an analogy to this. Midi dehave, apsuli hamukdashim. We find this by mukdashim. Let's say you have a carbon, an animal that became disqualified. It's psuli hamukdashim. To meikara ispuhu meila v'asira begiza ve'avoda. Originally, there's a prohibition of meila, and there's also prohibition to shear the animal, to work the animal, and parkino. But then, if you redeem that psuli hamukdashim, meila lespuhu, the meila goes away. Meila again is when you get personal benefit, you derive personal benefit from kachim. That goes away once it's redeemed, once the animal is redeemed. Begiza ve'avoda asira, but the prohibition of shearing, the prohibition of working the animal, that remains. And so maybe the same thing is true over here. When the husband dies, maybe some prohibitions go away, but some remain. Rashi explains, Meikara kodem pidyon, and again, before you redeem the psulei hamukdashim, v'asire begiza kedamrin dechsiv lo sagus. Again, there's meila, there's a prohibition of giza and avoda, but parkina, once they're redeemed, meila lesbuhu, there's no meila. Umutarin la'achila l'chaladam, anyone can eat the animal. V'asire begiza, but you're not allowed to shear the animal. Kedamrin bebechoros, as we say in Meseches bechoros, tizbach v'lo giza, you can slaughter the animal, but you can't shear it. Basar v'lo chalav, you can have the meat, you can't have the milk. V'darish le b'psulei hamukdashim, and we darshan that it's referring to our case over here, psula hamakdashin, after they are redeemed. So again, you see that after the redemption, some of the isurim fall away, but some isurim remain. And so the Gemara says, Ella, rather the source that when a husband dies, the wife is permitted, because the pasuk says, it says maybe he'll die during the war and someone else will marry her. That shows that after death, someone else can marry her. But Rav Shisha Brei Ravidi asks on this, maybe the pasuk, when it says another man will marry her, it's referring to the Yava. Maybe it's not referring to any man, it's just referring to the mitzvah of Yibam. Amar Rav Ashi, and to that, Rav Ashi says, Beis Teshuvas B'davar, I have two responses to that. Chada, number one, the Yavam lo ekri acher. Yavam, a brother-in-law, is not called an acher. Acher means some other man entirely, and so again, you see that with the death of her husband, she can marry anyone. V'yod ksiv, and furthermore, the pasuk says, Usneo ha'isha achron v'chasav la sefer krisos, o chiyamos v'isha achron, it says that the man hates her and he gives her a get, he gives her a divorce, or he dies. The iskish misa legerishin, so it shows us a comparison between his death and between gerishin. Ma gerishin sharia v'gomer is just like divorce. It permits her, it completely cuts her off, it severs her from the original marriage, and she can marry another man. Af misa sharia v'gomer. So too, when it comes to the death of the husband, she's completely permitted. She's completely cut off from her original marriage. And the Gemara continues, Va'yavama niknas bebia v'chulu. The Mishnah said that a yavama can be acquired through bia. And the Gemara says, Bebia minolan, where do we know that by yavama bia creates the kinyan? Amar krotz, because the pasuk says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video, and Daf Yudalid Amud Aleph.